This is very much an evening for Avon Needs Trees, which I think is a fantastic organisation, and particularly because they decided that their first venture would be 34 acres at Hazeland, just outside Caen. And there are some wonderful things happening there at the moment and will be happening there in the future. Our speaker this evening is Tommaso Jucker from the University of Bristol, but I'm going to invite the chair of Avon Needs Trees, Nikki Jones, to do some introductions, and then we'll take some questions at the end of the evening. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm going to give you more than a few introductions, actually. I'm going to give you a sort of overview of where Avon Needs Trees is. So we're going to sort of split the evening between us. So I'm just going to, I'm hoping you can see that all right. So yeah, I hope that's clear for everyone. So thank you very much, Ian, and thank you very much, Friends of the Marden Valley, for co-hosting this with us again. We're very appreciative of this collaboration, and thank you very much to everybody who's come along. And I know many of you will have been supporting us for many months, if not the last 2 years, because of course it is 2 years since we set up. So what I thought, basically, because it is almost our 2-year anniversary now, I thought it would be useful to use the first part of this talk just to kind of get you up to speed of where Avon Needs Trees is, and for those who have come along on the journey more recently, why we set up Avon Needs Trees and what our ambition is. And then I'm going to hand over to Tommaso, who's doing the research on carbon sequestration and trees at Hazeland, to give you a more sort of in-depth view of the technicalities of why we're doing what we're doing. So just to whiz through there, as I say, we're pretty much almost 2 years old. We registered with the Charity Commission in July 2019, and our aim is to create new permanent woodland. And that's the reason, I guess the thing that makes us unusual is that permanent bit. It is the idea that we buy land or take ownership of land on a very, very long-term basis, so that we have that guarantee that the trees that we plant won't be coming down in the next 20, 50 or even 100 years. So we're an intergenerational charity, and that brings its own challenges. We've got to really think very long-term, beyond our own lifetimes, because the trees will survive so long. But that's what we've set up. And the idea of Avon Needs Trees is that, you know, we first approached the Woodland Trust and asked them, would they buy Hazeland? And their point was that they really don't touch land that's less than about 100 acres. And that's obviously quite normal for big organizations like that. And we felt that there really was a niche for ants, for Avon Needs Trees. There is a reason why we called ourselves Avon Needs Trees, because we do see ourselves as ants. And buying those small pockets of land of 20, 30, 40 acres across the catchment area, sort of sowing up the biodiversity, and hopefully within 20 years, if not less, making a real impact across the whole area. So the point about ants being that, although it's that real recognition that as individuals we can do so little in the face of the many crises that we face, but together we can do quite a lot, and in fact really have that impact, as I say. So this is Miranda Krestovnikov on the right, who was at our launch last year, and there are a few of we trustees together at Hazeland. But just to whiz through very quickly, many people ask me, why did you set up Avon Needs Trees? It is you know, a real challenge, obviously, to acquire the capital for that land purchase, and most other tree planting charities aren't taking on that particular challenge. They're doing good work, but they're not doing quite what we're doing. And of course, just to state the obvious, this came first from our climate crisis. And I think, you know, really, I feel I have to start every talk that I give on behalf of ANT with this slide, because it's the one that we kind of slips from view as soon as we're not dealing with it. It's that that's from the IPCC 1.5 report in 2018, basically stating back then, there we were at that grey line. This thin line here is where we expect to be by 2030. We have very little time now. We need to understand just how urgent this is. And of course, that trees play a role, but not the role. And, you know, cutting out fossil fuels is, of course, the main thing. We don't claim that Avon Needs Trees, or even tree planting in general, is the answer to our carbon problems. Okay, so, and as I know, Tommaso is going to talk about more, the other real imperative for us was the biodiversity crisis, which really sort of goes hand in hand with the climate change crisis, and the fact that Britain is so unique in its in its bad state, largely because we've spent the last few centuries wiping out all our top predators across this country, which most of Europe hasn't. They've got wolves, lynx, bears, and so on, which we haven't got. And we've now spent the last 50 to 60 years taking out all those small insects and microbials that are at the lower end of the food chain. And now we're losing everything in the middle, the birds, the bees, the butterflies, and so on. And that's what we're beginning to notice. But this is something that we need to deal with very fast. So again, this was the imperative for ant. This was the third one. In fact, this was the map that really kicked off ant. When I went to an Environment Agency talk and they showed us this map, really demonstrating how very little woodland we've got across our whole watershed. And when we talk about Avon,
yeah.
Hello, we've got someone with their mic still on, I think. If you can mute, that'd be great. So this is the Bristol Avon catchment area. We're talking about the watershed being our boundary rather than the political boundaries. Little background noise there. Okay, and you can see there how little woodland we've got. And that, of course, is affecting our natural flood management. And for those of us in Bristol, you know, as I am, this is a particular worry because we are facing not just those higher incoming tides, we live on a tidal river, but meeting those high inundations coming in from inland with really nothing to stop that water coming straight down our rivers into the city that's right at the bottom, but affecting all of those in between, of course. And that picture in the bottom left is from Bristol in 2016, which again, you know, once it's out of the news, we tend to forget. So natural flood management is another one of our key imperatives behind setting up Avon these trees. And of course, there's a slew of others as well. Our water quality crisis, air quality, our antibiotic crisis, as the WHO calls it, our slow tsunami, because we're giving more than 50% of our antibiotics to our animals, and that's affecting, again, our land management and so on. Our food production, the Soil Association is telling us that we need to triple our fruit production over the next few years very quickly, and our public green space crisis, our mental and physical health crises. And I'd say actually that is one of the things, one of the real plus points and treasures that has come out of Hazeland rather unexpectedly. This was sort of low on our list of priorities when we bought Hazeland, but what has been so wonderful is the seeing the public enthusiasm and, you know, the public reaction to coming on site, the sense that this is a project that brings hope, that it gives a physical, you know, and practical outlet for a lot of the angst that many of us are feeling. So, you know, it really, you know, we found that Hazeland really is meeting a need, and we hope to go on, of course, and replicate that with other pieces of land. That map on the top right there is from the Bristol Avon Rivers Trust, and the red and orange areas are showing the rivers across our catchment area that are too high in nitrogen. So again, you can see that's the vast majority of our rivers across the area. And I know Tommaso is going to talk about this a little bit more, so I won't dwell on it. And you will all know that our government has set high, well, reasonably high afforestation targets, 30,000 hectares a year, but we are falling far short. And of course, you'll probably know that the Woodland Trust came out with their report 2 weeks ago saying we need to quadruple the rate at which we are planting native broadleaf trees at the moment, because we are falling far short. And although we are slowly increasing our canopy cover in the UK, very slowly, we are not improving the biodiversity within that, because we are planting mainly forestry and monocultures. So really what we're doing, again, is very, very much needed. And again, just to remember how unique the UK is, where Europe has an average of 37% woodland cover, we're down at about 13%. Our government target is around 16 to 17%. And of course, as you can see on that map, most of our woodland cover in the UK is actually up in Scotland. So England is very, very denuded with all the implications that brings. And I guess the other point about that, and again, I'm sure Tommaso will talk more about this, is the age structure of our trees. You know, we've had a little bit of a blast of tree planting in the 1980s with some tax incentives, mainly forestry again, and then we stopped. And so, in fact, the carbon sequestered in our woodland actually peaked in 2019 and is now on, unless Tommaso tells me that recent afforestation is changing this, but we have been on a sort of downward trajectory. So I will leave him to talk more about that. So onwards, so those are the reasons why we set up Avonese trees. So many real imperatives that we really couldn't ignore. And so a group of us took on this sort of rather wild challenge of trying to see whether we could raise the money to buy the first 34 acres at Hazeland, which are near Ratford, near Caen. And of course we managed it. We managed it actually within about 9 months, which was really quite extraordinary, with very much with the help, I would say, of the National Lottery Heritage Fund, with the Woodland Trust, who've given us fantastic support, and with big companies like Natracare, who've again given us huge support. But actually, again, so much of our support came from individuals, small companies. I mean, too many to mention here tonight, but the enthusiasm and support from the public, which I'm sure includes many of you who are listening now, has been absolutely wonderful. And you know, we are so incredibly grateful. So it enabled us to buy this wonderful mosaic of different habitats at Hazeland. It's a fantastic project for us to start with. I just thought I'd put up some historic pictures there of what was Hazeland Wood. That one on the top left is from 1844. The one at the bottom is from 1845. And this one on the top right is actually taken by a drone photographer who's here tonight, actually, Ian Collis. Many thanks for this. But he's been doing some drone photography of Hazeland for us. And again, you can see this very denuded area compared to the earlier maps, and that's the area that was lost post 1945 in that rush to industrialize agriculture. And it's, when we looked at it first, it was just being used for grazing, sheep grazing on a farming basis. So of course, Hazeland does have this wonderful mosaic of habitats. It's got 10 acres of ancient woodland, very neglected and now suffering from ash dieback, but very much high in canopy, low in understory, but very precious. Ancient woodland, of course, is less than 1.2% of the UK's surface. So it's very precious habitat here. And I know Tommaso will talk a little bit more about that. So again, for us to manage and bring back to good health so that it's great for carbon sequestration and for biodiversity. Lots of wet woodland areas, lots of springs, and of course it fronts the River Marden, which is again a river that's failing in its water quality tests. So you know, very interesting to start engaging with that and seeing how we might be able to help improve the water quality on that section of the River Marden. And again, there's more water storage on the site because we've got bits of the old ancient Wiltshire and Berks Canal and some man-made ponds, which again give us fantastic wet woodland habitat, which again we're just beginning to start exploring and surveying and recording data from at the moment. So it's an amazing place, and we've got these 20 acres that up until last December did look like this. As you can see, sort of very denuded, low-grade pasture, and which we've now pretty much covered in about 10,000 trees. We've continued. This is the map of what we've done, and we are, I would stress, very much ecologist-led. So we have, although we have gone ahead and planted 10,000 trees with the Woodland Trust's help and our own woodland officers, we've left large areas for rewilding. So we've left one whole field here for rewilding, areas of the lower pasture for rewilding. The whole woodland riverside meadow has been left to really adapt and do its own thing without any real interference. We'll have to look at how we stop that becoming a scrub over time. But at the moment, in summer, it's certainly an absolute gold mine of biodiversity, and we need to study that a little bit more before we even think about how we begin to manage that. We've also I mean, as I say, very ecologist-led. Our ecologists, before we got going on this, identified certain areas of species-rich grass, particularly in this lower field here. And so we've actually decided not to plant in those areas because they are too precious. We're certainly not into the job of destroying. So again, we've continued and built on this wonderful mosaic that was already there, but really set out to restore that woodland and manage as much as we can for our multiple goals. And here's some great pictures. In fact, that down there in the bottom left is Tommaso, who you're going to hear from in a minute, setting up his tree research. But really, we've transformed those two enormous fields, as I say, by planting 10,000 acres. That top left picture is our nursery, our tree nursery, where all our Woodland Trust trees were delivered, and then they were planted out in all weathers, as you can see from many volunteers, which of course COVID presented particular challenges this year because it had to be done in very small local groups, but we managed to get it done. We managed to get the 10,000 in. As I say, biodiversity is just as much up there. And one of the really, really important things for us is knowing what we have on site, and so that we know how to protect it. And particularly for us, then how we can record that data and put it up into county and national records so that it becomes, so that we really amplify the effect of everything that we do at Avon Needs Trees at Hazeland. And you know, we become part of that bigger national figure. So we know that Hazeland and the Marden corridor is the route for, well, we've identified 7 or 8 different bat species on site, but 4 of them are particularly endangered and protected. So again, we're going to have more surveys. We're paying out for these. We're going way beyond what our funders require of us in terms of biodiversity surveys, but it really is important for us to know what's on site and to make the best habitat there for them. So that we've got those 4 bat species, but we, again, with help with many volunteers, for British Trust for Ornithology volunteers and many others, we've been surveying for birds. Again, it's been held up by COVID, but this is something that we really plan to do much more of over the next year. But it's very clear that we've got a large number of red and amber listed birds on site, marsh tits being one of the most obvious ones, but also cuckoos, barn owls, and many others. So again, we've got those on site. We're committed to continuing to collect the data and monitor the impact of our work and hopefully their improvement over the years to come. We know we've got otter and water vole, which again are highly endangered, and many butterflies. We identified, I think, over 20 butterfly species on site last year, and amongst them, just one is the silver wash fritillary, again, very much endangered. So as I say, we're doing a whole raft of surveys. I mean, amongst the birds, butterflies and bees and otters, we've got lichen, fungi, dormice, pollinators, floral transects going on, amphibian and reptile surveys. You know, really, as I say, we're going way beyond what our funders have asked us to do. Just so that we can monitor this. This is from we've had 3 fungi surveys at the moment, and they've all come up with wonderful results, wonderful pictures, which are really giving us a lot of information. This is from we've had a volunteer ecologist here, Rosie Jackson, doing a dormice survey for us. We're pretty sure we don't have dormice on site. You will know that dormice are very endangered mammals across the UK at the moment, but we're hoping that by managing our woodland better, and we're experimenting with 6 dormice boxes, and by improving connectivity with our neighbours and linking up to neighbouring woodlands and so on, that we may be able to encourage woodland dormice back, or possibly in a few years' time we'll embark on a reintroduction programme, if that's possible. Again, we'll be taking masses of advice before we do anything like that. So I think the point here is that as I say, we recognise that we are ants. There's only so much we can do on a 34-acre site, and as individuals, mainly most of us working as volunteers, although we have now started to take on paid staff. But the point is, as ants, what we're aiming to do is amplify our work on a site like Hazeland with, first of all, the public engagement and education, so that people get to understand the different crises and what they can do. That's absolutely key to what we're doing. the university research, which you're going to hear more about, again, that amplifies the effect of ants and gives us a bigger purpose for owning land and doing what we're doing. The data collection that I've mentioned, again, which will feed into county and national records, which is so important, and the improving connectivity with our neighbours, again, so that we become part of a bigger patchwork of good practice rather than just being an island of good practice. And that's very, very important to us. But of course, our ambition is that we go far, far beyond Hazeland. Our ambition really is to at least acquire one section of land, one piece of land, at least every year. And this is the one that many of you will know that we were looking at and hoping to buy earlier this year. This was at Scene near Melksham, 19 acres with the prospect of another 5 acres, so 24-acre site, and it looked really perfect for us. And we, many of you contributed, and we were sort of ready to purchase. But of course, we were defeated in the end by something that we're becoming increasingly aware of, and we're having to think about as we go forward, which is the heritage aspect of things. We have to apply, if we're planting more or changing the land use of more than 2 hectares, we have to apply for an environmental impact assessment from the Forestry Commission. And generally they will ask for an archaeology survey and various other supporting documents. It was the archaeology that defeated us at Scene. It turns out that we hit the jackpot in terms of archaeology there. But in fact, actually, since then, of course, we haven't stood still. We have been looking at many other sites. We've looked at probably 7 or 8 other sites, and most of those are also throwing up issues around archaeology. You can imagine that we live on quite a crowded island with quite a long history, and there are Roman and medieval remains all over the place. And this is, potentially quite an issue for us and for anybody else planting trees or rewilding, but it's very much not being discussed at the moment, and many organisations really aren't aware of it. We're sort of launching a discussion with others on how we approach the Forestry Commission, because clearly this is a government priority that we need to reforest in the UK. But, really across the country, many organisations are facing the similar problems that we are. So the questions are for us at the moment, this isn't going to stop us, but we're going to have to find more ways to think outside the box and to manage land differently, possibly, using more orchard rather than woodland, perhaps putting a bigger emphasis on some of our biodiversity practices, and being prepared to plant less densely or in smaller patches, or phase out our afforestation a little bit more to stay within these guidelines. But so there are many things that we're thinking of at the moment and actively pursuing. So, we hope to have that next piece of land very soon, certainly by winter, so that we're planting again in winter. So it's really a case of watch this space at the moment. I would say the other thing that we have gone undone, apart from appointing Susan, who many of you will know, who's been managing all the events at Hazeland so spectacularly over the last few months, juggling COVID and volunteers and so on. But we've just appointed a director, really, because Ant has got to the point now where the management of sites is quite complex, and taking us forward to achieve everything that we need to achieve is really a time-consuming job. So we've actually appointed a chap called Dave Wood, who is out there somewhere in the audience. So maybe we'll have a wave from him at the end of the evening so that he can introduce himself. But we're really, really pleased to have him on board, and I think he's really going to take Avonese Trees to the next level, and really, really grow the organisation in the way that we as volunteers haven't been able, limited by time, haven't been able to do quite so well. So I'm going to leave you in a second, but I will just give you a quick plug and a quick reminder. If you're looking to think of ways of how you can support Avonese Trees, there are many different ways. Please do look at our website. I would say that we've got many events coming up, but this is one of them. Dave Goulson, who many of you will know is really a key bee expert from the University of Sussex, and he's going to be speaking for us with all money coming to Avonese Trees, because we've had his speaker fee kindly generally donated by a supporter. So if you're looking for a gift for somebody, or you're interested in hearing him speak yourself, then please do come along and indirectly support Avon Needs Trees. That's fantastic. Please join our mailing list. And it's the best way to find out about all the many talks and events that we hold, the many ways that you can support Avon Needs Trees, and hear about how others are supporting trees, whether it's running around villages dressed as a tree, or donating cars, or all sorts of things. We've had all sorts of wonderful different attempts to support us, which we're truly grateful for. And if you're looking for a way now that COVID's lifting to raise money for us, please do. We can help you with pub quizzes, teas for trees, information and material. We've got these wonderful booklets that were again designed by a volunteer for us. The volunteer support we've had has been absolutely extraordinary. But if anybody wants any children's books to look at the ancient forest of Fuchsian, which Hazeland is a fragment of, then please let us know. They're £5, which is an absolute bargain, and you can buy those on the website. And in terms of events coming up, we've got our first sort of series of sort of citizen science events, and the first one being a Spring Watch event, which covers the end of May and early June. And we'll be having some open tours, not so much science events, but a chance for people to come along and see Hazeland and really get a feel for it and what we're doing there. And that's on Wednesday, the 26th of May, I believe, and we'll be holding more during the summer, on weekends in particular, so that those of you who can't make it midweek will be able to make it. And we'll also be having a wildflower walk on Sunday after that. I forgot the exact. The 30th. Thank you, Susan. So so please do look on the website, and on our events section you'll find information about that. But I hope that's a good overview of where Ant's got to in just 2 years, and I hope you will agree that that's quite a big leap in 2 years to have a sort of fully functioning organisation, ready to buy its second piece of land. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Tommaso, if that's okay, who will talk more about the sort of nitty-gritty about the tree planting and the carbon sequestration.
Thank you, Nikki. Just while I share my screen, I wanted to start, before I say anything, by thanking Nikki and everyone at Avon Needs Trees for this, not only for this opportunity to speak tonight, but just more generally for this opportunity to engage with this really brilliant organization. So I was thinking back at I first reached out to Avon Needs Trees. I think it was about June or July last summer, sort of we were just getting out of COVID, and someone sent an email to the University of Bristol, has an institute called the Cabot Institute, which tries to sort of think about bigger picture about environmental issues. And there was a call for sort of collaboration between the Avon Needs Trees and the university there. And I reached out without really knowing what to expect. And it's really been a brilliant collaboration, and I've really enjoyed it over the past few months. And it's been a really great way to sort of also get out of the house during COVID and all of that kind of thing. And on a personal note, this is slightly embarrassing, but I like to share it because it's a big audience. I'm a forest ecologist by training, but before sort of getting involved with Ant, I'd never planted a tree before. So this was sort of my personal excuse for getting involved. But aside from that, again, thank you all for joining us this evening. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the research that we are trying to do in collaboration with Ant through the University of Bristol, where I'm based. I'm a forest ecologist by training. I'm currently a lecturer at the University of Bristol, where I lead a research group which is called Selva Lab. If any of you are like me, from an Italian background or a Spanish background, you'll know that Selva comes from the Latin silva. It stands for forest, so that gives you a hint at what our sort of focus is. The kind of research that we do is trying to understand how forests are responding to rapid environmental change, essentially, be that climate change or land use change or other pressures that are being placed on these ecosystems. This is we do this research in lots of different places around the world. We work in Southeast Asia, in Australia, and until recently we worked less in Europe, but actually COVID has been made the opportunity to work closer to home more relevant, which is what I'll talk a little bit about tonight. But just to give you a flavor of the kind of work that we do and why I think it's important. What you're seeing in the background here is a top-down view of a forest. This is a tropical forest in Malaysian Borneo. The colors reflect the height of the canopy. So the bright yellows are really tall emergent trees. And as you transition down to the blues, this is where forest has been cleared. And you can see these polka dot pattern in the background on the blue, that's oil palm. And so we're trying to understand how these sort of human modified landscapes operate and function. And some of these issues that affect forests in the tropics are sort of, you can translate them directly to what we see closer to home. So part of the kind of questions that we're trying to understand is how much carbon can these ecosystems, these human modified ecosystems store, and how might that change in the sort of the coming decades as the climate changes. And that sort of ties into sort of the theme of the talk this evening, which is thinking about essentially nature-based solutions to climate change. How can planting trees, which we're talking about at ANT, help us in sort of bridging this gap as we try to transition to a sort of more carbon neutral or negative economy. I've put solutions there in brackets. So nature-based solutions is a very sort of hot topic at the moment, but it's as Nikki did a really good job of before me introducing this whole topic. It's not just about planting trees. In fact, it's not. That's only part of the puzzle. But that's sort of the topic that we'll explore this evening a little bit. And the context for that, and apologies for repeating a little bit of this, but it's hopefully from a slightly different perspective. The reason why we're thinking about this is because we're faced in the middle of what people are calling a climate emergency. Since pre-industrial times, the planet has warmed on average about 1.2 degrees Celsius. Some of you will have seen this figure in the background before. If not, I think it's a really nice way of visualizing climate change. So what this is showing you is each vertical bar here corresponds to 1 year. So going back to 1850 all the way to present day, so from the left to the right. And the color of the bars reflects the temperature relative to sort of a mean between the 1960s and 1990s. So blue indicates that year was a cooler year, and a red corresponds to a warmer year. And you can very clearly see that you sort of feature along all the way up until the 1960s, and then all of a sudden we're getting into trouble. And there's this sort of strong spike in sort of warming temperatures, and that coincides very clearly with increasing CO2 emissions. And there was a sort of latency period in there where essentially the oceans absorbed a huge amount of CO2 that was emitted in earlier periods, but that's sort of fading off, and we're now really starting to see the effects of that climate warming. I think someone might not be on mute. I'm just going to, if anyone is, apologies for the reverberations. So that's the context. And just again, this is a slightly different visualization of something that Nikki touched on already. This is from the IPCC 1.5 degree report. The reason why we stress this 1.5 degrees is that there's a general consensus that if we want to keep the worst effects of climate change from happening, we need to keep warming within 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. Anything above that, we're really starting to get into territories that are kind of uncomfortable and are going to have really, really big implications. So what this graph here is showing you is that there's a historical trend of what temperature has looked like from the 1960s to just before the year 2020. And we've got this slow sort of like steady rise in temperatures. And then there's a series of projections of what that temperature change might look like in the future, depending on different scenarios, depending on what we might do, whether we do nothing, we just continue as business as usual, or where we implement different types of changes. And these are the kind of tools that policymakers and scientists use to sort of gauge what are the most important things that we can do. The message that comes through clearly from all of this research is twofold. First and foremost, if we are going to keep climate warming within 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius, we need to rapidly decarbonize our economies. So we need to stop emitting carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. We need to stop mining fossil fuels and using fossil fuels. We need to substitute those for green energy and all of that. The thing is that compared to where we were maybe 20 years ago, now on top of that, we also, if we want to meet these targets of 1.5 degrees to 2 degree warming, we also need to think about how we can absorb some of that excess CO2 which has been emitted to the atmosphere and capture it back into some form that is on land. So it's no longer enough to just decarbonize. We also, on top of that, need to think about carbon capture, and that's where forests come in. And more generally, where nature-based solutions come in. So there's part of this attempt to remove CO2 from the atmosphere will take a sort of a geoengineering approach, where there's physicists and engineers and thinking about ways to develop new technologies to sort of sequester CO2 from the atmosphere. But the truth of it is that we already have that technology has already evolved on land. It's been evolving for the last 500 million years. And plants do this job really effectively, both on land and in the sea. And so there's this potential to essentially use forests or other ecosystems to absorb CO2 from the atmosphere. The reason why people tend to focus on forests when thinking about this kind of issue is there's a few reasons. One of them, I think, is personally most of us can appreciate, and the idea of planting a tree. Most of us can get behind that message. Part of it is something that Nikki alluded to in her talk before, that actually in many areas of the world we have pushed forests beyond an equilibrium status, and they're currently in a position where they can take up and absorb a lot of CO2 from the atmosphere before reaching that equilibrium status again. So there's potential to leverage the fact that we have in fact removed forests from lots of from huge areas of the earth for that purpose. And why forests is well, it's quite simple. Trees live a long time, and therefore they store that CO2 that they capture on average for a long time, which is really what we need to transition us to that new phase where we're emitting fewer greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. And so the reason behind this map, which is showing sort of forest cover in Europe and thinking about what it looks like today and what it might look like in the future, is why many of you will have seen these kind of headlines in the papers. This idea that tree planting is almost a silver bullet, that we're going to be able to get away from all of our problems to do with climate change simply by planting trees. So before talking a little bit about the work that we're doing on a much smaller scale at Hazeland with Ant, I just wanted to touch on this a second and put some numbers on it. So what is really the potential of forests to sequester carbon from the atmosphere? This is one of the best pieces of evidence that we have trying to put numbers on this issue. So what you have here is a slightly complicated graph, so I apologize, but don't worry too much about the details. What you have is 20 different sort of nature-based solutions that we might implement to sequester CO2 from the atmosphere. And they've been categorized into major groups. So there are things related to forest and forestry, things to do with agriculture and grasslands, and things to do with wetlands. And essentially the take-home message here is, the bigger the bar, the further it extends to the right, the bigger the potential for that intervention to sequester CO2 from the atmosphere. And what you'll see quite clearly is that first chunk at the top, labeled under the forests, is the one that holds the biggest potential. That's where we've got the biggest gains to be made. To put this into context, if you add all of those bars together and worry a little bit less about the uncertainty around those bars, roughly we're talking about a third of all of the sort of negative emissions that we need to think about in order to get ourselves on track to less than 2 degree warming. So again, even when you add all of nature-based solutions together, that only gets us about a third of the way to what we need to do in order to get us past this climate crisis. So again, not a silver bullet. But if we just zoom into that graph a second and just focus on the bit about forests, you'll see that there's a few different categories here. The one that we're really talking about this evening is that top bar there, that reforestation bar. And so what this means is classifying what reforestation is a bit vague. In the case of Avon Needs Trees, we're talking about active planting of trees. In some other cases, it might simply mean not going in and intervening and letting things do their own thing and forests regenerating. Regardless, the point is converting land that is currently not forest and to forest. And the point to make from this graph is that that bar is huge. So the potential is really quite big to have a meaningful impact on what's currently going on. At the same time, however, there's some caveats that we need to be really aware of. The first one is that black line that's going through that bar, that's giving you a sense of the uncertainty. So how confident are we of this estimate? And the uncertainty on this estimate is huge. The reason why it's huge is because we don't yet know how effective we can be at planting trees. We don't yet know where we should be planting trees and where we shouldn't be. And there's also issues about making sure that we get that message across properly, that we don't get ourselves in a position where this idea that it seems like a quick fix to plant trees essentially leads people to do the wrong thing. And just finally, another important point here to make, and something that anyone who's worked in collaboration with Ant will know, is that reforestation compared to other nature-based solutions is not a cheap option. In the case of Ant, you need to buy the land, but you also need to find a whole bunch of people who are willing to volunteer their time to come out and plant those trees. So that's a considerable cost in terms of people time, whether it's volunteer or paid based. So it's implementing it at scales that we're talking about globally is something that is not going to be easy. And I guess that's why, sort of counter to that first headline that I showed you, is why you also all be familiar with headlines such as this one, where people are having fierce debates about what kind of species should we be planting, where should we be planting, where should we not be planting trees, and all of that. And so I don't want to go too far off track, because as I've highlighted, there's clearly a huge potential to have positive impacts of planting trees, not just for carbon, but also, as Nikki mentioned, for biodiversity, for well-being of people, for water cycling, and all of those other co-benefits. But it is important just quickly to think about how we do this on a big scale and how we manage it. The favorite example that I like to give in these cases, thinking about close to home, so not necessarily having to travel halfway across the world and thinking about these issues, but one of the big things that is a controversy in the UK is, where do we plant trees? What trees should we be planting? A key message is we probably shouldn't be planting trees on peat. So this is a study that came out just this year, where they've actually gone and quantified what happens when you, on a peat bog, this is in this case in Scotland, you go in and you plant different species of trees, so pine or birch. And although in both cases, you obviously see a gain in terms of carbon from above ground. So those trees are growing, they are sequestering carbon, and that carbon is being stored above ground. We must not lose track and then sort of forget what's happening below ground. So this research, essentially the conclusion that they came to was that while these trees are sequestering carbon above ground, below ground, the development of these root systems, the associated sort of microbial organisms that grow in association with these tree species actually end up releasing a huge amount of CO2 that's currently stored in the soils. And that CO2 isn't offset by the trees for decades. So it takes, once you plant a tree on a bog, you're committed to losing carbon for decades before that's sort of leveled out by how much carbon you've gained in the trees. So again, my aim here is not at all to dissuade people from planting trees, but I think it's really important that we communicate the nuances of doing this so that we get it right. Because at the moment, it's something that we hear a lot about, and it's something that is not just anymore within the sort of scientific realm that is discussed, but it's really very much in the sort of a political agenda and so on and so forth. So just getting that message across is really important. So okay, so enough with the doom and gloom. I want to talk more about the potential, the potential of doing this. This graph is one that I like to talk about and I like to present because I think it really is a key piece of the puzzle. So most of this map is gray, but there you'll notice in the background that some of the pixels are colored in these hues of green. What those hues of green reflect is how quickly any given piece of land on Earth could potentially sequester CO2 from the atmosphere if turned to forest. So the reason why most of it is grayed out is because they've masked out areas that naturally are not forests. So again, we get rid of those controversial bits like peatlands that we just talked about, or savanna ecosystems elsewhere in the world, or whatever your favorite pick is. And they focused on areas which are marginal land, so areas which are not key to agricultural production for feeding people. And you'll notice that the tropics, unsurprisingly, pop out as dark green, so there's huge potential to sequester carbon quickly. But actually, I think really promising from a UK perspective, the UK is one of the darkest green areas outside of the tropics that you see anywhere in the world. And part of the reasons for that is that actually the UK, if left alone, and I'm including Ireland in there as well, has potential to sustain some really interesting forest ecosystems, particularly towards the west, sort of these temperate rainforest ecosystems that store lots of carbon. But the other side of the coin is that, as Nikki told us so eloquently before, the UK overall is quite depauperate in terms of tree cover compared to most other industrialized countries, most notably its European neighbors. So there's a real potential here to think about how we manage land in the UK. And I think this is where I get excited by sort of interacting with people working in organizations like Avon Needs Trees, because there is a real feel and a sense that there's a grassroots movement going on where people are rethinking what our landscapes should look like and what they might look like for the next 50 to 100 years. So this is, again, slightly complementary to what Nikki showed you before, but this is sort of like trying to put some numbers on what people are trying to do in the UK. As Nikki mentioned to you, currently forest cover in the UK sits somewhere at about 12 to 13%. Scotland is higher than that. It's closer to 20%. A lot of that is because of sort of monoculture plantations. So not much of that is due to sort of broadleaf or not necessarily broadleaf, but native sort of forest cover. But the ambition here is to take us from that sort of 12, 13% up to about 17 to 18%, which would involve planting sort of quite considerable areas of land per year. We're talking in the region of 30,000 hectares per year, and we're currently not meeting those targets quite yet. But to give you a historical context of that, if we do bend that curve, which we have already started to bend, and increase forest cover in the UK, we'll be bending a trend that goes back almost more than 1,000 years. So it's been a long time since the UK has had sort of considerable forest cover across its land. And again, I think that it's really exciting to be part of at the start of these sort of attempts to bend this curve and take us back to something new and exciting. So I've given you the very, very big picture. It's a more almost global picture of where we stand and what the potential is for reforestation in terms of carbon sequestration. I now want to take you much more local. So this is a picture of the field site of the site at Hazeland. This is the top field in the maps that Nikki showed you earlier, and this each of these tubes contains one of these precious trees, one of these precious 10,000 trees that have been planted at the site. And very graciously, Ant have let us at the University of Bristol take up a small portion of this land in the top field and set up an experiment. And the aim of this experiment really goes back to that figure I was showing you before, with that bar graph with all those big bars, and the fact that we have this huge uncertainty on how effective tree planting can actually be. So what we want to do is test out a few solutions that might actually bolster and boost the performance and the success rate of these tree planting initiatives. So what I hope that all of you will see when you look at this figure and realize is that these trees are being planted in a space that's not necessarily their native habitat. So while this field, as Nikki told us, was a woodland up until 60 or 70 years ago, it's not been that since. And in the interim, it's certainly been grazed for several decades. It may have been used for cropland. That's not something I know, but it would be really interesting to know exactly what its historical land use was. In any case, these trees are being planted in a context which is not necessarily where they would naturally sort of germinate and grow. So one thing that's obviously missing is the overstory, so the trees, but actually what's much more subtle is what's happening below ground. So these trees are being planted in sort of in grassland soils, which are, in terms of their biodiversity and their soil nutrients and their soil structure, are very different to the environmental conditions that trees would naturally sort of encounter. And so the message I'm trying to get across here is that forests are more than just trees. And what's going on below ground might be just as important as what's going on above ground. So what I've got a picture here is a picture of a nematode. This is an organism that some of you will have heard of, some of you will not have. But if you were to collect a teaspoon of soil from a woodland, there would be literally millions of these within that teaspoon. And along with those nematodes, there would be millions of bacteria and billions of bacteria, and there would be spores of all sorts of different types of fungi, and there would be different types of invertebrates, and they're all of those species are interacting and in both positive and antagonistic ways with trees and plants. And those interactions are really critical to how those trees grow. So one of them, the ones that I suspect many of you will be familiar with are fungi. In case you're not and you're interested, I cannot recommend this book enough. This was a book written by Merlin Sheldrake, who I was fortunate enough to do my PhD with several years ago. It's a book called Entangled Life, and it's just an exploration of fungi and everything that they do, and this magical world that's been unseen to us for until very recently. And so what I'm trying to get at is that if we're trying to think about restoring forests and woodlands, we probably also need to be thinking about restoring their soils if we really want to get the most out of these tree planting initiatives. And so because I'm a scientist by training and my brain is now wired to think like that, the way that we set up to do this is to set up an experiment. And so what we've done is we've taken, as I said, this small parcel of land within the bigger sort of context of Hazeland, and we've set up an experiment which I'll describe briefly in a second. But the aim of it really is to test two basic questions. The first thing is, what happens if, when we plant these trees, in addition to planting the trees, we also inoculate them with some soil and leaf litter from an adjacent ancient woodland, which in the case of Hazeland is literally tens of meters away? Can doing that simple treatment of inoculation essentially help restore the biodiversity of those soils. You can think of this a little bit like a sort of what might happen if you've taken a course of antibiotics and your doctor will prescribe you a course of probiotics to restore your gut microbiome. It's the same kind of concept. But the flip side of that question is thinking, okay, so if we do this, can we not only restore the biodiversity below ground, but also jumpstart essentially the restoration process of those trees? Can we boost their growth? Can we increase how quickly they start sequestering carbon from the atmosphere? And can we bolster them and increase their survival? For example, if a drought were to come along or some sort of adverse climatic event, can we increase the chances that they will make it through that period? So this is what our experiment aims to test. This is a picture of it. You can see there's a little post there. It says B4L. So now it's got a marker, so it's an experiment. That's pretty much the standard there. But what you'll notice around those trees that are planted there within those within the cages, there's underneath it we've added some treatments. So in this case, that L there under that B4 stands for litter. So we've re-added some litter from the ancient woodland, and we've done that to some trees, but not all of them. And equally, we've added some soil from the ancient woodland to some trees, but not all of them, as well as the combination of the soil plus the litter. And our goal really is to monitor that through the next several years and hopefully decades to get a sense of what the impact of this intervention might be. This is just very schematic diagram of what that experimenter just described actually looks like. So what we have is we have 4 replicated blocks. So each of the blocks is identical to the others. It's so that we can statistically analyze the data on the other end. Each of these blocks is about 20 by 15 meters. And within each of these blocks, we have these 4 treatments, which I mentioned. So we have some control trees where we've done absolutely nothing. They're just planted as you would in a normal field. And then we've got some of them to which we've added litter, some the soil, and some the litter plus the soil. So if I just zoom into just one of these to give you a sense of what it looks like, within each of those blocks that I just described, we've got, again, those 4 treatments, the control, litter, and soil, and the litter plus soil. And then we planted 4 different tree species within them. So we're looking not just at one species and how it behaves, but multiple species. So we've got alder and hazel, beech and oak. These were chosen partly because they're part of the mix that was being planted at Hazeland, but also because these species associate with different types of fungi. They have, some of them are what you call ectomycorrhizal fungi. Some of them are vascular mycorrhizal fungi. Some of them are much more plastic in terms of the associations that they make, and some are less. So it'll be interesting to see how those results differ. And then we've got this replicated out. So in total, we're talking about 480 trees that we'll be monitoring, and that we've started monitoring over the next few years. So again, this is a picture of one of the plots. But the important thing to stress here, and one of the really key things that drew me in particular to Avon Needs Trees, is this potential to do an experiment like this which has really long-term sort of implications. So the fact that the land is sort of now committed to being reforested in perpetuity is quite is something that's quite rare. And as an ecologist, it's a huge opportunity to really study and understand what's going to happen over long periods of time, which are needed in these kind of ecosystems. So this is what a typical sort of forest succession gradient would look like on the sort of axis of time. And these forests are sort of recovering through time, and that process is a long one. So the fact that we have access to that data for a long time is really valuable to us. And I'm prefacing that because obviously at the moment we've set up the experiment over the winter, so I'd love to be able to show you some results, but we don't really have any yet. We have completed a first census of the plots where we've measured the size and dimensions of all the trees. And we've got some initial interesting results linked to the recent dry period. This is older in particular, looking at what happens when you add litter on the left and when you don't. You can see some pretty striking differences to their susceptibility to drought, and we'll have to see how these play out over longer time periods. But yes, before we can get sort of the long-term vision, you're going to have to be patient and possibly invite me back at some point to give another talk on to update you. So apologies for rambling on. I hope I haven't taken up too much of your time. There's a few minutes for questions, but yeah, just thank you all very much for listening and for Avon's Needs Trees for engaging. Yeah.
Tommaso, thank you very, very, very much indeed for what I thought was a comprehensive review and overview of some of the issues that we're facing and some of the potential solutions. I'm going to start off whether anybody's got any questions for Nikki first, because I thought Nikki's presentation was equally a tour de force and a tremendous confirmation, I think, of the vision that those that set up Avon Needs Trees have had. So are there any questions? I'm going to suggest if people wave, so you'll need to put your cameras on, because I might not be able to see you. So if anybody would like to ask Nikki a question, then we'll come back to Tommaso if we may, please. Or just shout out if you like. I think, Nikki, your presentation was so comprehensive that you've answered, which actually doesn't surprise me at all, having listened to it very carefully, surprised me at all. So we're going to move on. So thank you, Nikki. I'm going to move on to Tommaso. People must have questions for Tommaso's very erudite and I thought absolutely fascinating presentation.
I think there are a few in the chat block, actually. Anyway, sorry.
No, thank you, Nikki. I've got John Bennett that's waving. So I will kick off with John if you want to ask a question, John, and then we'll go to the questions in the chat box.
Yeah, it was just a quick question about, do you think that lichen and the other tree-living organisms like that, are they going to be any sort of influence on how trees grow successfully or not?
That is a brilliant question, which I don't think we have an answer to. If I had to guess, I would imagine that it'll take a while for lichens and mosses and that kind of those kind of organisms to grow back, particularly the ones that grow on trees. It'll be years before we see some of those on them. But in terms of ones that are growing on the soil, particularly things like mosses and that kind of thing, and the fact that the land is no longer being grazed, the ability of those sort of communities to retain moisture in the soil might be very different to a grazed pasture, and so there might be knock-on implications in the coming years because of that. Yes.
Have you thought of, as you say, inoculating the new stuff? There is an incredibly interesting little bit of woodland in Calm that is probably the most alive with lichen and moss that I've ever seen, which might be worth paying a visit to and just seeing if you can nick a couple of bits off of them, really.
Personally, I'd love to see it. Yeah. No, we haven't thought about that. So that's a great idea. The interesting thing is that essentially, since we've sort of set up this experiment, we've just had a flurry of ideas of different things that we could potentially do, and yeah, so I have to again apologize to everyone at Avon Needs Trees, because we continue bombarding them with sort of suggestions of things that we might do, and so it's also trying to be realistic of what's actually achievable and whatnot. But yeah, I like that. I don't think anyone's looked at that, if I have to be honest.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I'm finished.
Thank you very much. Good to see you, John, as well. Before I bring Matt in, there are, as Nikki quite rightly says, one or two questions in the chat box. I think it's, yes, Mike's asked the question. I assume Nikki will answer this, that the slides, particularly Tommaso's slides, will be available on the ANTS website, and people are nodding to that. And then I've got another question, I think it was from Derek, which says, is there any value in planting some fast-growing softwood trees with the intent to thin them out as the broadleaf trees mature? So
it's an interesting question about, I think it hits at the so there's a bit of a rift in the community between people who would classify themselves as foresters and people who would classify themselves as sort of forest ecologists. I think that often people who have a background in forestry feel that they are being unjustly targeted for this idea that we might be planting softwood species or species that are non-natives as a way to quickly absorb carbon. And I think there is a place for that, not just because we need to think about carbon sequestration, but also because we use wood for so many other things. So we can't, on a national scale, it'll never be enough to simply plant broadleaf trees. I think that mixture of land uses will always be part of it. The other side of that question is a really interesting one, which is, in what order should we be planting trees? Just as an example, might you get a better outcome if you plant lots of really fast growing early successional species such as birch initially, let them take hold, and then successively introduce things like oak and beech, essentially simulating what happens in a natural ecosystem. I think there's huge potential to test some of these ideas out, and I suspect that probably there is an optimal combination of the order in which you do things that you could essentially get the best outcome from.
Thank you, Tommaso. I'm going to come back to the chat in a moment, but Matt's been very patient. So Matt, ask your question, please.
Hello, can you hear me? Is that right?
Perfectly.
Fantastic. Tommaso, I really enjoyed that. It was fantastic. Two questions. One, I suppose, and it's on the monitoring of how you're going to do it, and I apologise, everyone, if this is going to get a bit sciencey technical. What is the monitoring process of the soil? I'm presuming some sort of meta barcoding to see how the nodding community moves on. And then my second question is whether you're doing any comparisons with the rewilded areas and how the soil community changes naturally through that natural kind of succession.
Yeah, so great questions, both of them. So yes, so I didn't really touch on the technicalities of the methods, but essentially one of the reasons I think why everyone's very recently become interested in what's going on in the soils and below ground is that it's actually only become really possible to study what's going on below ground comprehensively in the last 10 to 15 years. And it's really due to sort of the coming of age of molecular techniques that allow us to sequence soils and really get a full understanding of what's growing in them, all these things that we can't see with the naked eye. So yes, so part of that will be sort of next generation sequencing of soils. So we've collected samples before any trees went in the ground, so we have a reference of what things were like at the beginning, and then we'll be sort of sampling through time and looking at how those communities below ground reassemble and change through time, and whether any of those interventions that we're doing are having an effect on what's going on or not. So that's one thing. We have thought about this, the comparison between the planted sites and the ones that are naturally regenerating. I think that's a fun, really interesting question about, again, going back to how do we get the best value out of this. One thing that I think is underexplored in places like the UK is just the value of just letting land be and regenerating naturally. So I think it's really exciting that Ant are doing that. The slight challenge is that the two sites are not directly comparable because they're not adjacent to each other. So one is lower lying and it's near the river. The other one is sort of at the top of the hill. And so the soil types and the soil conditions are actually quite different to start with. So it's a little bit challenging to do that, but essentially, yes, we'd love to do that.
Thanks, Tommaso. We've got lots of other questions coming in. Jack is waving his hand enthusiastically. So Jack, and then I'll come back to the chat box. Jack.
Okay, a question about the control plantings only. At this time, what is your feeling as you look at the out years about, will you consider or not remove any lower limbs to accelerate the process of it becoming a canopy tree? And what is your current thoughts if there's damage to trees due to ice or wind? Are you just going to let nature be, or to be within your process to go in and do some selective pruning to, again, help them return to being proper canopy trees?
So I think there's two parts to that to answer that. One of them is there's an initial phase, right, which is what we're going through right now, which is the establishment of these trees that have been taken from sort of a nursery and planted in the ground, and it's quite a critical phase because they're having to establish their roots really quickly and sort of get going. So it'll be interesting to see what happens over this summer. And hopefully, like I showed you some pictures before of the alder where we didn't add any leaf litter, and the differences were quite stark. I don't necessarily think that all of those trees will have died, but they definitely did take a hit from that drought period. So whether there will be a need to replace some of those trees so that we have a full experiment at some point, I'm not quite sure of. Longer term, from my perspective, the vision is very much to let nature do its thing. So I'm sort of advocating for a lesser intervention and sort of letting the canopy reestablish, and also letting natural regeneration itself happen. So if for instance, seedlings were to naturally regenerate within the plots, we'd encourage that, and we wouldn't thin them out, we'd let them sort of grow.
Us to show ID, nor was that expected.
So thank you very much. Somebody else has left. Fascination of what somebody's saying to their partner, I suspect. Thank you very much. That's very helpful. There's stacks of questions coming in, Tommaso. We could be here all night, and we will be here all night, but we won't be. But let's just continue if we may. I've got a question from Kanishka. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Do you have to be conscious of the presence of farmland bird species, which are also in decline when selecting a site for reforestation? Is that handled as part of an EIA?
Well, that actually might be a question that Nikki can also pitch in on. But generally, as a very general answer, I think yes, we going back to we need to be careful about where we plant trees and why. There is a need to not just get too carried away on a national scale and plant trees everywhere, because that will obviously also have impacts on other things. But I'll let Nikki take the specifics of it.
You know, I was just answering a question online there. Was this the question about farm? Sorry, I missed the question, Ian. Can you just repeat it?
Yes, this was the question about birds in terms of the impact on farmland bird species as part of the reforestation program.
Yes, I mean, when we were looking for getting the EIA for Seend, part of that was an ornithological survey, and part of that would have been, if we'd found lapwing in particular, that might have stopped us getting the EIA. In fact, in the end, it was the archaeology, and there were no lapwing. But yes, certainly those things are important. And it appears, I mean, we're just really finding out. I have to say, with the EIA, the Forestry Commission's guidance is absolutely not clear on exactly what criteria and at what level they take these different things into account. But yes, if it seemed we had found lapwing, that probably would have made our getting the EIA a little bit more difficult. But it's something that we are actively seeking now, clarification from the Forestry Commission on. But we, you know, as I say, fundamentally, ant is not in the business of destroying habitat. So, you know, if we find something that's valuable and endangered, we want to work with it, not against it.
Thanks for that. I'm going to quickly whip through some more questions. I know that Nikki's been answering some of them, and then I'll quickly come to Robert McNaughton, who's waving. I've got a great question from, I'm not sure, Petty E02, I think. The kids love planting trees. If you've got a small garden, apart from at Hazeland, where can you go and plant trees? Do we know the answer?
Yeah, if Nikki might know this better than I do, but one thing that is interesting to flag is if people also living in urban environments, there are quite a few initiatives within Bristol and in other cities, I'm sure, where people are sort of joining together as collectives to do these things like these tiny forests and other initiatives where people are sort of getting small parcels of land and planting trees at really high densities. And sort of recreating these small patches of woodland. And I think it's an absolutely brilliant way to not only create urban green spaces, but also to get people engaged with nature and sort of get them out there and get thinking about what's going on and all of that kind of thing. So I think there are opportunities to do that.
Can I just add, I'm a big fan of guerrilla planting, and I've done quite a bit where I live in Seamills in Bristol. And yeah, it's wonderful. For my birthday, I went out and bought 50 hedging plants and got a group of friends together. We went out planting. I think about 15 and 20 have survived over the last 3 years, but it's wonderful. Every time I go on a walk, I see my trees growing, you know, and they're there. So yeah, I'm a big fan. I've also planted wildflowers out on public land and so on. So I think everyone should just have a go. Don't worry if you haven't got the land yourself, just go for it.
Thanks, Nikki. Robert McNaughton.
Well, given the brilliance of the talks tonight, I think, Nikki, you were exceptional in opening up the conversation. Tommaso was quite mind-blowing, really, with respect, mate. I was wondering what Dave Woods thinks, because Dave is going to take over from Nikki, and Nikki is an institution of the west of England. And Dave, mate, I know I've dobbed you in it, but I was wondering how you react tonight and what you're going to have to cope with.
Well, you've done my job for me. Where's Dave? Is he?
He's there. I can see him. He's
Oh,
on
you can
mute.
see him. I can't see him. Right. Okay. Over to you, Dave, who is our new director, who will be starting at the end of this month. In fact, at very early June.
Yeah, incredibly exciting to be taking over from Nikki. Massive shoes to fill. I'll be starting on the 2nd of June. So really, I'm just in listening mode this evening, absorbing all the information, and really excited to be working with you all.
We really are thrilled to have Dave. You know, as I said earlier, I think he's really going to help develop Ant big time. So no, it's a big step for us.
Excellent. Are we happy to take some more questions? Keep going.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Great, excellent. So I've got another question from Jack McKinnard, I think, where he says, expanding on previous questions, it's well established that grass control is key to the success of saplings of tree survival. Will the inoculated trees be mulched repeatedly over the year to ensure grass is kept down? The controlled trees look like they may be unmulched. Would it be better, he says, to quickly bringing it down, would it be better to have a control with sterile leaf litter or soil?
So very interesting. So this one part of that. So we did actually, when we inoculated all the trees, we did add sterile soil as part of our controls. So essentially that's sort of mimicking what you would do as a placebo if you were a doctor, if you were doing a sort of a medical trial. In terms of the leaf litter, we have actually not added any mulching material to the trees in the controls. I actually think that it is true that it is well established that the competition with the grasses is a big deal for the young trees, and generally across the land at Ant, there's now a sort of concerted effort to try and mulch as many trees as possible across the site. I think that in many places people are not mulching them, other locations across sort of across the UK. So I think it's actually quite interesting for us to have that control where we have unmulched trees, and we can really tell the difference between those and the ones where we've added the leaf litter. It does obviously beg the question of what exactly is driving the effect of the leaf litter addition. Part of it will be hopefully the biodiversity side of things, but part of it will also be grass suppression, and part of it will be changes in microclimate to the soil. So it's teasing those apart will be interesting in future years.
Tommaso, I've got Sarah, who I think is probably after your job, because she says, what qualifications did you take at undergraduate level? She's looking to get back to school, so to speak, and doing A level environmental science, but interested to hear. So how did you get to your lofty height, Tommaso?
So I was an absolutely terrible high school student. I did my high school in Italy, which is very different in the schooling system to the UK. But yeah, I only sort of got my act together in my final year of high school, and it was as almost always the case. I had an inspirational teacher who got me interested in sort of ecology and geography and those kind of things. So I ended up doing an undergraduate degree in biology, and it was just, for me, it was a switch. It was just like, okay, I now get this. This is something I'm really interested in, and I really enjoy it. But yeah, I guess the first step that almost everyone would take that has sort of followed my path would be traditionally to do an undergraduate degree in sort of life sciences or geography or something like that is sort of the traditional pathway. I think there's many opportunities to be involved and engaged with nature and these things at a really high level, even without having to do that. And organizations like ANT provide one of the ways of facilitating it. So there's more than one pathway for sure.
Thank you, Tommaso. I've got a couple of questions for Nikki, which are, one, all the trees are planted in a very uniform way. Is this, does it make for a rather unnatural look, rather like a plantation? Question mark.
Actually, I think the pictures that you've seen close up are of Tommaso's research, where they are planted in lines, but actually outside of his research area, they're not. It is much more random and much more natural. And actually what I didn't say is, particularly in the lower area, the lower pasture, really that's mainly scrub and shrub that we planted, hedging plants, because we want to keep the vegetation there low around those species rich grass areas. And again, we've planted hedging all around the edges and so on. So no, I think you'll find, I mean, apart from Tommaso's area, it is going to have a very natural feel to it.
I think you answered Lauren's second question in the second part of your answer, Nikki. So that was very adept. Thank you. Indeed. Tara, will you water the trees if there's a drought, and if so, will you make this consistent?
Yes, so I think initially, as I was describing this sort of differential between this initial period and the sort of longer term goals, I think initially we would look to try and make sure that the trees have the absolute best chance of getting through the sort of the establishment phase. And if we were to do that, we'd obviously do that systematically. So we try to water them in giving them the same amount of water as close as we possibly could. Longer term, I think it sort of, if the trees need watering on a regular basis for many years, then potentially that's telling you something about the fact that the whole thing is unviable, right? So if they're not able to cope with their conditions and they need to be treated as a garden, then something's not quite working. So longer term, I think the goal has to be that these reforestation and tree planting initiatives are able to self-sustain and get going. So I don't think it wouldn't be in anyone's interest to be watering them for years and years and years. But getting them through the initial phase, I think, is important.
Thank you very much. I'm aware that time's ticking on, and the quicker we answer the questions, the more new questions appear. So I'm inclined to end about 8:30, and then I'm going to promise those people that have asked questions that haven't been answered on behalf of Nikki or possibly Dave or maybe Tommaso, that somebody will come back to you with an answer. So we won't ignore anybody, but I do think that we probably do need to finish around 8:30. But the next one up is from Linda and Andrew. How can trees really sequester carbon without harvesting for timber, which survives in buildings, rather than decaying and releasing carbon? Do we know how much carbon survives in soils after trees have been harvested or just rot? I think that's a really interesting question.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a question that in general that we don't have a very firm answer on. It's something that there's a lot of research on. I think there's an interesting point there is sort of what happens to the tree after it dies. So in a natural setting, in a forest, if a tree falls down or dies standing, it will eventually rot, and a lot of the CO2 the carbon that makes up its mass will be released back to the atmosphere, but not all of it. Quite a substantial portion of it will actually be stored in sort of in recalcitrant, what we call recalcitrant carbon in the soil. So things that are actually really hard for other organisms to break down. And so they'll stay there for decades, in some cases centuries. Not all of it, but portions of it. At the same time, I think there is also an opportunity there to be thinking about how we use some of this timber and this wood that's being produced by these sort of reforestation initiatives and store it long terms in things like building materials or furniture or whatever it is. The problem comes when you're essentially growing timber quickly to then cut it down and turn it into products that quickly sort of decompose and are returned to the atmosphere for whatever reason. So long-term uses are great.
Thank you very much. I mistakenly thought that the last X number of comments were questions. What they are, in fact, is thanks and expressing, I think, real pleasure at the presentations that we've had this evening. and lots of wonderful questions and so forth. So I think we might actually be there. If anybody hasn't had their question asked and they would very much like to do so, please wave now, or as they say, forever keep your peace. I kind of think we're at the end, but Susan, yes, Susan. Yes, Susan's got a question and Miles got a thumbs up. So Susan, I'm going to give you the last question, if I may. Or it might have been Susan showing appreciation by waving her hand, I suspect.
Hi. Hi.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there's anything could do to help with the research. As I'm doing my I'm a conservation student. I was doing a placement at Hazeland, or I am doing a placement with Hazeland.
We are definitely looking to get people involved and engaged with the research. So there are plenty of times when we can use the help. So if you're looking to get involved, absolutely feel free to drop me an email. And
brilliant.
Yeah.
Cool. That would be great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the great presentation.
Thank you. And in fact, I misled you. There's one final question, which is from Sharon, and that is thoughts about including trees that may be better adaptive to climate change. What are the trees that we should be possibly planting that have a much greater chance of surviving the climate change?
Yeah, so I mean, that's as part of what you will have got from both of our presentations is that we are currently committed to some level of climate change, regardless of what we do, regardless of how quickly we decarbonize our economies, regardless of how quickly we're able to sequester CO2 from the atmosphere. We will see climate change occur over the next century. The real question is how much. In terms of trees that are better adapted or worse adapted, it's a complicated one because it's not just about as a species level, but it's also at a population level. So you might take the same species, like for instance, European beech, and you look at its distribution and you'll see that it grows everywhere from Turkey to the UK. And so it's able to cope with very, very different conditions. But part of that is because each of those populations is adapted to that specific type of condition. So I think as we get more sophisticated about tree planting, one of the things that we're going to start seeing more and more of is people thinking about the provenance of some of these seedlings and possibly thinking ahead. So we might want to, for instance, plant trees of beech trees that are currently growing in southern France, because that's what we think the climate will look like in the west of England in 50 or 60 years time. So I think we will become more targeted in the future.
Tommaso, thank you very much. I think we've come to one of those rather nice natural moments where the meeting is rolling to an end. So on behalf of the Friends of the Marden Valley, which is the group that I chair, thank you very, very much to Nikki and to Tommaso. If you wanted to be inspired by trees, this was the place to be this evening, I think. I wish Dave Wood all the very best. What are you doing at the moment, Dave? What's your current profession, as it were?
So I'm an election campaign manager at the moment, winding down from that, and I'm a councillor and cabinet member on Bath and North East Somerset Council.
I thought I recognised you, Dave. Well, I wish you all the very best, although very sad that you're leaving the Lib Dems, but there we go. But no, I wish Nikki all the best with her new endeavours as well. And if we've missed any of the questions, I'm sure that Nikki and her team will come back to you. Nikki, do you want to, shall I give you the last word? I think it's appropriate that I do.
Oh, well, thank you. First of all, I'm not disappearing immediately. Although Dave's going to take over my day-to-day job, I'm going to stay on as chair for a bit longer, just to make sure he's got his hand held and that you know, that the transition for Avon East Trees is smooth. So I'm very pleased to still be involved for a little bit longer. But yes, I just would like to say thank you again to Tommaso in particular, whose support at Hazeland is fantastic, and you know, is just a pleasure to work with. And thank you again to Robert and to you, Ian, for your chairing, and to Susan, who has put on the whole event. So many thanks to you all.
Susan, thank you. Thank you very much, and good night, everybody.
Yeah, good night.